Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few moments. Okay, thank you all for joining us this afternoon on Politics and Prose Live. We're here to discuss The Dead Are Rising by Les Payne, and you can purchase a copy of that book via the link that I've posted in our chat column. If you click on that, it'll take you to Politics and Prose's website, and it's a great way to support our author and to also support your local independent bookstore. Secondly, I wanted to let everyone know that the latter portion of today's talk will be devoted to your questions. We highly encourage everyone to ask a question, and you can do so by clicking on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that and type in your question. You can also read other people's questions, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. We also have a chat for you guys to use, but if you could try to keep your questions to the Q&A and not the chat, it just makes things a little bit easier. And with that being said, today we are here to discuss The Dead Are Rising, The Life of Malcolm X by the late Les Payne. Les Payne was a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist, and he embarked in 1990 on a nearly 30-year-long quest to interview anyone he could find who had actually known Malcolm X. The result was an epic biography that draws on hundreds of interviews to paint a definitive portrait of Malcolm X, one that separates fact from fiction. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Tamara Payne, Les's daughter, and also his primary researcher, who completed the book after her father's passing. She also wrote the book's introduction. Today, Tamara will be joined in conversation by Joe Davidson. Joe writes the Federal Insider, formerly the Federal Diary, a Washington Post column on the federal government. He is co-founder of the National Association of Black Journalists, a two-time Pulitzer juror, and the recipient of numerous awards. So please join me in welcoming Tamara and Joe.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you, Tammy, to talk about the book that you co-authored with your father. In full disclosure for the audience, he was a good friend of mine and also a co-founder of the National Association of Black Journalists. And so, you know, he and I would talk about this book from time to time over the years, and it was really many years of work on this book. I think I'd like to begin by asking you to talk about the title. It uses the word arising instead of rising. Can you explain to our audience what the significance of the title is?
Yeah, the title basically meaning that you're coming into consciousness, and it refers to the when people joined the Nation of Islam, and when they were outside of the nation, they were considered dead and had not accepted or come into consciousness to who Black people were, and accepting the teachings of Elijah Muhammad. And when they joined the nation, they were considered arising or risen, and also family members at that point. Dad liked playing with language, and arising had a lot more energy and fit in with the iambic pentameter for him. So he played with the language.
Well, you know, it's his love of language that certainly came through in the columns that he wrote for many years for Newsday, where he was an editor before he retired. And certainly in this book, it's crisp. You know, it's kind of a driving book. It moves along. And, you know, as a reporter, one of the things we often learn about and talk with other reporters about is paying attention to detail. We talk about reporting a lot. We certainly did that a lot at NABJ and at the Trotter Group, it's an organization of Black columnists that your father co-founded. And there's so much detail and so many interviews in this book. I'd really like to learn, in addition to getting into what the book says about Malcolm, and I have a number of questions along those lines. But I'd like to learn about process of reporting this book. He started it 30 years ago. And so perhaps one question that comes to mind is just, why did it take so long?
He wanted to get it right, basically. He was really, he knew that this was a really important story, and he wanted to make sure, I mean, he was he was constantly tinkering with these chapters. I mean, he would write a chapter, and I remember reading an earlier version, even of Hartford chapters, of the Hartford chapter, and thinking it was great. And then he was like, yeah. And then he'll come back and he read totally different and still great. And he was just constantly editing. It was like it was a never ending process. And then I got to see even more how much of a never ending process was when I got involved with that after he had passed. But he was constantly he just kept playing with the language and what was coming out of this and what he wanted to come out in this story. So, and then also what took a long time was, when we first started in 1990, he wanted to get as much information about Malcolm's life from anybody who knew or worked with him. And so it was a lot of people. And then there were a lot of people, it was always like, can we get to them? Can we get them? Sometimes it might be months that it would take. So, this project really took on a life of its own. As far as like constantly finding people who knew them. And then as time was passing, we were like, wow, these people are starting to die off. Like Dad spoke with Captain Joseph, who was second in command with Malcolm in the Nation of Islam at the Harlem Mosque. And, and he died in 1990, I'm gonna get the year off by a year probably, but 93. and I met him too, and he was just very strong character, but it was just, knowing that we could talk to him before he passed. We did not know that he wasn't well and that he would pass while giving, before he died, he gave that key piece of information before he left. So it was a lot of that kind of process, and just trying to make sure you get as much of the story as possible, because you want to touch every aspect of Malcolm's life as you can and verify it and analyze it. So that was part of the process. It was a lot of interviews. And then there are a lot of interviews where we may not have directly quoted from them in the book, but we use them to help give us the sense of the scene. So to bring readers into these scenes, into what was happening, particularly when we're talking about when Malcolm was first joined the nation, and we were able to speak with the couple that he had moved in with after he came out of jail. He first lived with his brother, and then he moved in with the Mustafa's Hussein and his wife. And, and they, became friends. And then they were, Malcolm was determined to attract the younger, more educated crowd into the nation, while the other members at that time tended to be older and working class. So that was kind of a shift, and that was bringing new energy into the nation. And it also caused tension with the other people who were there. So it's like learning about all of that. Like, what was that like? What did that mean? And Dad was tenacious, and his interviewing and then getting these types of details, and it comes out in the book.
It certainly does. I mean, the book is rich in details. I mean, some of which we'll talk about in a minute. But still on the process, about how many people were interviewed for this book?
I would say coming up to 100, definitely. Mm-hmm. But it was hundreds of hours, because we didn't just, interview them for, an hour. Dad spoke with the brothers, Wilfred and Filbert in particular, at least 7 or 8 hours just in the first interviews. And then he would go back years later and interview them for a couple more hours here and there to, corroborate what information he was learning that they may not have brought up, or to expand on information that they did bring up. And he was able to find out even more, and then find out what they thought about that. And that was really the process. He did that with even the Husseins and everybody. I mean, when you're working with that massive of people and meeting them and getting to know them, and Dad was a master of getting them to be comfortable in talking with them, to speak with them and tell their stories, because it cut down in time, but it was still a lot of hours. It was hundreds of hours of interviews.
And tell us how he decided to start this book, because certainly there's been a lot written about Malcolm X. So why did he decide another book was needed about Malcolm X? And let me also say that this book has some it breaks news, I think, and there's information in here that I don't think you'll find elsewhere. But he couldn't have known that when he first started. So I don't assume he started to break news. But so why did he decide to write the book to begin with?
He did kind of want to break news, actually.
As a journalist, I guess so. That's right.
You know, as a journalist.
But did he know there was news to break? I mean, did he know there were some things? Did he know there were some things that were unknown?
Yeah, well, that's what the initial attraction was to the story. Malcolm, Dad, as you know, he admired Malcolm. He
Right.
talked about him a lot, I'm sure, with you over the years, and
Sure.
he definitely, like he would play his speeches for us on the weekends, and
Mhm.
we were always talking about Malcolm, in the house growing up. So he admired Malcolm, and he would read his, autobiography, and he would play his speeches. So he was constantly, thinking about Malcolm and Malcolm's analysis of the Black condition in America in particular,
Right.
and also his analysis later on of what was going on in the world with oppressive regimes, such as in South Africa and the Congo. And so he really was, he was very interested in that. But he also felt that through the speeches and the autobiography, that we had everything we needed to know. And if you think about, like, if you're going to do the socio-political analysis of him and looking at his speeches, you can make that argument. But on the other hand, what Dad happened to do when he was in Detroit visiting with his very good friend, childhood friend, actually, Walter Evans, who was at the time a surgeon, and I think Filbert was one of his patients. And he introduced Dad to Filbert, and Dad talked to him for a few hours and got this amazing story out of him. And he came back and he processed it, and he thought about it. And I remember I was at the time, I had come back from China, and I remember him just talking about this interview. He said he met one of Malcolm's brothers, and he spoke with them, and he was just processing it. And then he went back. He talked with the colleagues in New York, and one of them being Gil Noble, who hosted a show here called Like It Is, which is very important for the Black community in the tri-state area here. But he also was very interested in Malcolm, and he said, "Well, which brother did you speak to?" The one you really should speak to is Wilfred. So Dad said, "Okay, journalist," going back to Detroit and spoke to Wilfred, and a man just got this amazing story about Malcolm's childhood. And what he realized is that we don't know where Malcolm came up from. We don't know what his lineage really is. We don't, at that time in 1990, we really didn't. And Malcolm also, young people were again returning back to him, listening to his speeches, and rappers were quoting from him. And Malcolm, actually, after he died, he never left the scene because people continued to listen to his speeches and read his autobiography. So what Dad found out was that he was learning more than what he read in the autobiography. And he just said, "There's a lot here."
Right.
And so that started it, and then was just finding out what the lot would be. What was that story going to be? But he wasn't trying to disprove, and I can't say he was going to try. He wanted to do a biography that looked at Malcolm from cradle to grave. But as far as like being definitive, he wanted to tell whatever the best and most accurate story he could tell, based on as a journalist.
Right.
And he wasn't, that was his focus.
He gathered so many details while doing this book. And some of the information in the book, in some ways, it's like a mini history of Black America. I mean, when you read this book, you come away learning not just about Malcolm X, but you learn about Marcus Garvey, you learn about Du Bois, you learn about Martin Luther King. And there are also some surprises. You learn about Malcolm's meeting with the Ku Klux Klan. And again, one of the details that struck me was Malcolm was was in Atlanta talking with a group of people, and the book describes how a telegram was passed from the back of the room up to the stage, and then that eventually led to a meeting with the Ku Klux Klan. Why don't you tell us about that?
Okay. Also, I want to say is that we want to talk about the world that Malcolm was born into. So that's also, it wasn't just this family life and what he came from, but the world around him. And that's why you get this, we're putting Malcolm in context of what was going on around him. And so
and the stories of his childhood and his parents, those are also very rich as well. So we can talk about that as well. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
So what we were talking about as far as meeting the Klan and how this unfolds, Malcolm was a visiting minister in Atlanta. The minister of the Atlanta Temple for the Nation of Islam at the time was Jeremiah X. He was placed there by Elijah Muhammad. And it's important to understand that Elijah Muhammad was at that time the leader of the Nation of Islam. So even though Malcolm's face is as a national spokesman, he, and eventually kind of becomes the face of the Nation of Islam at times. And this also created a lot of jealousies. He's not the leader. So whenever something happens like this, he has to go back to Elijah Muhammad and say, how do you want to do this? And, in this case with the Ku Klux Klan, Malcolm has already had experiences with this group. The group has harassed his family on numerous occasions, one being when he wasn't even born yet, he was in utero, and his mother had to stand up to them. And that's how we open the book. But also when they lived in Lansing, Michigan, they were on land they had bought from somebody but the deed had an exclusionary clause, which meant that Black people could not own that land. And the white neighbors organized to get them evicted, the family evicted, and burnt their house down. So he has these experiences with white supremacy and Klan and Klan's actions, Klansman actions. So he's not in favor of doing any kind of organizing with them or helping them. He wanted to have a face-off. And when he goes to Elijah Muhammad with Jeremiah X to discuss, this telegram and what do they want to do, he pretty much really wants to have kind of a face-off with them and nothing to do with them, but wants to confront them. And Elijah Muhammad, on the other hand, he sees what he wants to do. And I think it's important to also understand, again, context. What the civil rights groups are doing at that time in the 60s, this was in 1961, what the civil rights group, Martin Luther King and the civil rights group, particularly in Atlanta, are doing, and what the nation's doing and what the Klans are doing. Civil rights group want desegregation, roll back those Jim Crow laws, get the Voters' Rights Act, passed. These are all things that they're working on. They had the bus boycott years before, which had successfully, worked on getting the buses integrated. And so they were working on integration. The Klansmen don't want integration. They're pro-segregation. So they look at the Nation of Islam, and Nation of Islam is Elijah Muhammad. He doesn't want to work, he don't want to deal with white people or mainstream America. He wants to have a separate state with their own laws, with access to water. And, they don't want to vote. They don't want to work themselves into this society. And so the Klans is looking at them, well, maybe we can work together against the civil rights leaders and the groups and what they're doing. They felt threatened. They felt their world was threatened. And that's why, you kind of have this, that's the context of it. So then Elijah Muhammad, who does want to have a separate state, he's saying, well, since the Klan is down in the South, we can they can either help us get land to set up our separate state, or if they won't do that, they can, we can have a relationship with them in which they don't harass us as we make our move around in the South and set up our own businesses, our farms, and everything that they're trying to do. And that's what he was looking to do. And Malcolm, he didn't agree with that at all. He felt that this was setting up an unholy alliance. Right. But on the other hand, he wanted to have kind of impact on this meeting. So he agreed to stay in the meeting, but he didn't agree with it. And also, when they reported back after the meeting, this really starts to set up this separation from him. He starts to drift from Elijah Muhammad at this point because he doesn't agree with this. This is an unholy alliance, and and he doesn't feel good. And even later on in his life, the week before he died, he talks about that meeting and says he regrets his participation in it.
I remember telling your father once that I think I retained more of the autobiography of Malcolm X than any other book, but I
Wow.
don't recall Malcolm X writing about that in his autobiography, and certainly writing about the Klan suggestion that the Nation of Islam and the Klan worked together to assassinate Martin Luther King, which is reported in your book. That must
Well, he didn't write about that in his autobiography, but he definitely mentioned it towards the end of his life. I mean, yes, that book was written at the end of his life, but he was also in the beginning when he set up to write that book. He wanted it to promote the Nation of Elijah Muhammad and Nation of Islam, and then after he splits while writing this book, he wants to change the direction of that, and that's how it becomes more his his story. But also, that was also Alex Haley's goal. He always wanted to do really Malcolm's story. He didn't want to do anything on the Nation of Islam. But
I mean, that was another scoop from your book.
Yeah.
But let's also talk about the context of Malcolm X and how he became who he became to be. And part of that was the influence of his parents, who were very political. His father was a Garveyite. So can you explain how his youth, how his family helped him to become eventually Malcolm X?
Both of his parents were Garveyites. They actually met at a Universal Negro Improvement Association meeting in Montreal, and they were very much attracted to Garvey's principles of uplifting the Black race, building their own business, being self-reliant, and having Black pride. And they were both, attracted to that and wanting to build. And we're talking in like 1920s.
Right.
So, again, context, what's going on? Like 1919's Red Summer of Terror, where you have going around the country, these lynchings are going on of Black people, where white people want to keep Black people in their place. And in Red Summer of Terror in particular was started because of the Black veterans coming back from World War I, who were fighting for American liberties, freedom abroad, and then coming back home, again realizing I fought for these freedoms, but yet I don't have them, so I should have these freedoms, and they're demanding them, and white people are just saying, we don't agree with this, and therefore using terrorism and to keep Black people in their place, and lynching and keep them fear, and keeping white separate from Black, and not outside of the South. I mean, this is also in the Midwest. So Garveyism was in the 20s. He was telling Black people to be proud of who you are. It's also interesting to me that when we talk about when you brought up the KKK meeting, we should also say that Garvey also met the Klan,
right?
And there was he wrote an essay about his meeting with the Klan in Atlanta also, and that was in I think 1922, and he and his whole idea of that was he believed that the Klan was what white America was, and what they were the example of what white minds were, what the white mindset was. And he says, I'm not trying to negotiate with them. I think we need to think about setting up our own place in Africa even. So he was saying, let's make white man wants to make America white, and Blacks, we should go to Africa and make that a black continent, actually. So you still have that happening, and we talk about that in the book. So what was I talking about? The
influence of Garvey.
So the influence of Garvey, they were about building up their community. So his parents, what they would do as organizers, move out to the Midwest, to places where Blacks were not organized, and they would organize. They would set up an organization there, and they would meet and organize, and encourage people to build up businesses and figure, organize to support these businesses so that they could flourish in these towns. I wanted to read a little bit from the book, if
Sure.
I can.
Sure.
And just kind of about when we talk about the child life, this is when they were children. And this is really talking about Louise, the mother. So the story of Little Black Sambo, published this is actually from the chapter called The Anchor is Lost, and it's just before the father dies. The story of Little Black Sambo, published in 1899 by the British writer Helen Bannerman, was a standard children's reader at Pleasant Grove. The illustrations of the dark Indian child caused derisive snickering among whites, but the pickaninny slur, along with the unrestrained banding about of the term nigger, repulsed the little children, who were taught at home to disparage such put-downs of the Black race. As the taunts escalated, it was their mother, Louise, who conditioned Malcolm and his siblings not to overreact to the racial slurs. We didn't like being called the nigger, Wilfred said, but we would try to downplay it. My mother always told us that you can handle racial slurs in a way where you can make them continue, or you can let them think they're not going to hurt you. They're not hurting you. She would give an example. If you're throwing darts at a dartboard, there's a satisfaction you get when you hit the target. When you miss it, you get another feeling. She said, it's the same with white people. When they're throwing darts at you by the things they say and do, but if they don't hit the target, then they won't get that satisfaction, and eventually they'll quit. And usually that's the way it worked. This psychological training for resistance to racial provocation was conditioned into the behavior of young Malcolm and his siblings. Their behavior earned grudging respect among a growing number of whites in their neighborhood, despite, and in some cases, because of their adherence to Garveyism. Mm. So Garveyism, she taught, it was in the household. Garvey also, had met with, with Wilfred and, with Earl Sr. and Louise. She was the recording secretary at a lot of those meetings, and she would take the minutes and those meetings. And he met with them, particularly during the time when he was getting into trouble with the law, in New York, when they were going after him for the Black Star ship. That
he also wrote for a newspaper, correct?
She wrote for the newspaper.
Yeah, exactly.
And Earl Little is mentioned in a few of those articles. She talks about some of the meetings and that Earl had led, and his activities in organizing and wherever they were at the time. So we talk about, so Garveyism was really a foundation for Malcolm that never left him, and the brothers. I mean, it was Garveyism that attracted, I'm getting a little ahead of it in the story, but attracted Wilfred to the Nation of Islam, while Malcolm was in jail. It's Wilfred who's looking, to do something, not just work. He's married, and he's looking for something to be involved with his community, and it's the Nation of Islam, and he's attracted to it because of their principles in Garveyism. And he realized this is an organization. He agreed with everything about the organization, but he saw that this was a group that he could grow with. And there was a younger component to it, and he wanted to organize, and he brought his siblings into it. And eventually they were able to bring Malcolm into it. And Malcolm, when he was in jail, of course, after, he was hustling and doing the crimes, and he was serving 7 years in jail, he needs to pivot. He doesn't want to stay in jail. He wants to pivot into something else. This gives him something to pivot to. And
he became not only the spokesperson for the Nation of Islam, but he and others in the nation regarded Elijah Muhammad as like their spiritual father, and they were willing to do everything, anything for him. So that relationship with Elijah, proved to be very influential in his life. But after a while, that relationship started to deteriorate, and Malcolm found himself moving away, I guess, emotionally from Elijah. And can you talk about that process? The book makes it clear that it was a process for Malcolm to come to grips with the fact that Elijah Muhammad wasn't the man he appeared to be.
Yeah. Just to start off with, it was the father's death that really hurt Malcolm, right? Malcolm also believing that his father was killed by the Klan, and he uses this throughout, when he's preaching and talking in the Klan, in the Nation of Islam, about how his father died. But he was close to his father, and when his father was no longer in his life, that removing that anchor for him was made him keep wanting to search for that father figure, and Elijah Muhammad filled that void. So, and also keep in mind, he had drifted away from his family and their foundational values when he was in Lansing and Mason, becoming a teenager, and then going to Boston and getting into. I mean, he was smart, but he was also getting into the street life and becoming very involved with and working on the. And let's not forget, he also worked on the railroad, in which he got to see all the East Coast cities, D.C., Philly, right, New York, and going back up to Boston. So all of that is happening. And then while he's doing it, that's when he's hustling, as was everybody else at that time. And now he's pivoted into the Nation of Islam, and Elijah Muhammad is his father figure. But as I alluded to, started talking about with the KKK meeting, he is starting to outgrow. Basically, it's what it comes down to. He's outgrowing this, because even though the Nation of Islam doesn't want to be involved, they want to have a separate state. Malcolm sees, his people as the 22 million Black people in America, and not all of them are in the nation. And he wants to see Black people in America flourish and thrive. And that means there are some Black people that aren't in the nation. He still wants to reach them. And so, and so there are things that he wants to do. He wants to get more involved in the nation with the civil rights, what's going on with the civil rights movement, and having more to say on that. And Elijah Muhammad is always trying to pull him away from that. Also, when he's preaching things like self-defense, somebody comes after you, you protect your family, you protect your women, you protect your children. But then when incidents happen, like when Hinton Johnson is beat up by the New York police in Harlem, or the temple in Louisiana, and as well as other temples that were invaded, and there was, problems with that. And, they're being invaded by the police and white society, and Malcolm wants to go back. Ronald Stokes was really kind of a huge, issue for this. Ronald Stokes was his friend out in California who was killed, when the police ran up into the temple, and that really hurt Malcolm, because Ronald Stokes was a stand-up Nation of Islam member man, and a good friend of Malcolm's, and
he was dissatisfied with Elijah's response.
He was not. Elijah was always saying, we cannot engage the police like that.
Right. And
Malcolm was angry about that. And he's like, I'm out here preaching self-defense, and then we're not even doing that. Mm-hmm. We're only, that also. So he's feeling, that's a disagreement. This is the dissonance that's happening, and it's pulling away. And so to me, what I explain to people is that, a lot of people say, oh, it was the children and Elijah Muhammad's, his immorality. And I said, well, that was a part of it. There were mounting issues, and these issues that I'm bringing up, how, these negotiations, these incidents of what's happening and how they're not defending themselves, among other things. I mean, there's also growing tension and jealousies building within the nation, because people are jealous of Malcolm and that he's out there. And people in the royal family, they feel that Malcolm's, going to threaten and try and take over the group from their father, and to outmaneuver them in their whatever their is passing down what the leadership is going to be. I mean, there are a lot of things happening that this was going on, and it was a process. So all of these things are happening, and it's growing, it's backing off. He's trying to work with people, but it's all happening, and it all comes to a head, and he ends up having to leave after he he disobeys those orders of saying something, chicken's coming home to roost. But it was growing, it was mounting.
And before we go to questions from the audience, how about Malcolm's evolution away from the nation and is going to Africa, and that influence, because that became a very important part of his post-nation life.
Yeah, I mean, what Malcolm's, when he leaves the nation, he's alone, but yet he still wants to organize. You need an organization. You can't fight this beast of racism and oppression and anywhere by yourself. You do need an organization of people to help you, to get your word out, to support you, to represent you, as well as what you're saying, and getting other people, interested. And that's what he wanted to do in organizing. And so he focuses on, his taking the Hajj and traveling. And also because he's now free, he's also meeting with members of the civil rights organizations like the SCLC Corps and others. And he's attending meetings where they're discussing what the next move is. And this is in, let's say, 1964. And there is a meeting where we talk about where he comes up with the idea of taking the civil rights fight to the international level and making it a human rights issue and taking this to the United Nations. And in doing that, he also wants to go to and travel around the world and to gain support for this. And that's what he was doing, as well as organizing at home new organizations. He was a Sunni Muslim. He believed in Sunni Islam. He was going to have his Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which was going to be the Islamic arm of his. He wanted to keep that separate from the other, social political grouping of the Organization for African American Unity, which he was modeling after the Organization African Unity. He went to the OAU conference in Cairo in 1964. He speaks there, and but it's all also, learning, taking the Hajj, learning more, and studying, Islam, Orthodox Islam, being a Sunni Islam and Sunni Muslim, and also learning more, visiting these other countries and learning more about what's going on in these countries, and how it's being practiced. And he sees a lot. So he's really drumming up support. He goes to Africa, he goes to Ghana, again, he gets to meet with different leaders, and it's all because he's trying to meet with them, build up a relationship between Black Americans here, African Americans here, and the continent, as well as gain support for our issues to be taken to the United Nations as a human rights issue, that America is violating our human rights.
One more question before we open it up, and that has to do, this gets back to some of the incredible detail and reporting in the book, and it has to do with his assassination. It's really a blow-by-blow account. Much of it furnished by an undercover New York police officer who had infiltrated the nation and was actually one of Malcolm's bodyguards. And the detail is so gripping, down to Malcolm's last breath. It's really an incredible recounting of that story. The detail in that was so graphic, and I guess that came from the kind of intricate reporting that your father did, and I guess largely from the account of this police officer.
You have the police officer, but you also have a lot of people who are on the scene, like Yuri Kuchiyama, James 67, Benjamin Kareem. They're all contributing their perspective of what happened in that story, in that incident, in that time, because it's not just that day. Gene Roberts, who's the undercover police officer, he was part of the security force for a while, right?
And he talks about a trial run on this assassination before it actually happened.
Right, and you can hear it. I mean, there is this speech where you can actually listen to it, and you do hear what we're talking about in the book. If you listen to it, but it's also even in the transcription in the book. It's one of the final speeches from the week before, and Malcolm is killed, and it's chilling when you realize what is going on. It's just chilling. But Dad interviewed, and he was determined also to find out, what happened from, who planned this out. He was tenacious. Mm-hmm. Was tenacious on this. he spoke with people in Newark. He spoke who were on the Goon Squad, who broke down how it was planned. I mean, this is frightening stuff. I mean,
that's true.
You know.
Well, I have more questions, but let's go to some of the questions from the audience, and I'll say, as indicated earlier, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box down at the bottom of the screen. One question for you, Tammy: has it been a challenge to move from being a researcher working on the book and in the background to being a co-author with your father and in the forefront of this effort? And how have you been received by the public and the literary world?
I think that second part still remains to be seen. This book just came out this week.
Right.
But Dad and I worked on this together. I mean, yes, I was his researcher, but I was also his confidant. And when he really talked to me about what he was thinking about and how he saw the shaping of this book. And I always felt more than just a researcher. I felt like I was a partner all along. So that's why I'm very intimately, involved with this, because I was on there from day one. I was there when he, said, okay, I think this is when we're going to do this meeting. I write about that in the introduction, where we have a meeting with Faith Childs. And, she was a family friend, and we were just talking, and we were talking about what's going on. And Dad said, and he was still processing these interviews he had with Filbert and Wolf. And he said, I think I'm going to do this. And it was, it was kind of shocking. And I went back when I came back from China. Even after that, I was home for the holidays, but then I came back permanently the summer later. And we were just kind of jumped into this, working on getting this story. And it was exciting because meeting, I was in charge of also getting to who these people are, finding out who these people are and trying to find them. And, and we were, while in the earlier days, you could say we were working on it, but like Dad was still working at Newsday. He didn't stop his day job at Newsday. Right. And that was many positions. I mean, he was a columnist, he was a manager, he was sending, reporters off to cover all these stories, Bosnia, all these stories that were going on at the time. And he's covering that. He's highly involved with that and loving it. He's also doing Sunday Edition. He's working still also with NABJ, and even started the Crowder Group in the process of this. And so we were working very closely together on this. And what it was that we already had a close relationship. It deepened during this. Mm-hmm. And so when he passed in 2018, unexpectedly, it was just devastating for me, because I miss my dad. I mean, we were so close, and just, and pretty much the manuscript was finished, but we were already in editing stages. And, but he was really handling that, but we were talking every day about that. And I was helping him at, full time at that point. And when he passed, I mean, I have to say, my mother and my brothers, they helped support me and taking on this and making sure that I had everything I needed to stay committed to this full time to get this published. We had Norton, they had signed on with Dad, and they, they were convinced that this is important enough to continue on, and we worked for it. So yes, it was challenging, but it was a worthwhile challenge. And to me, there was no way I could not finish Dad's project and not have his life's work out there.
Right. The next question is picking up from what you mentioned regarding Malcolm's push for a human rights lens. Can you speak to how Malcolm's thinking and actions were the basis for unifying allies across racial divides and internationalizing the Black struggle in America? In particular, how he influenced the Asian community in the US and internationally?
At the time, I mean, with the Asian community, it was interesting because it depends on, which Asians we're talking about too. Like, there was a woman, Yuri Kuchiyama, who joined the Organization for Afro-American Unity, specifically because she respected Malcolm and she appreciated what Malcolm was doing. But what Malcolm, during those last years, you're traveling, and he gets to travel and he sees what's going on out there in the world firsthand. He doesn't necessarily always he understands what he's read, he's studied, but when you're traveling to, you don't fully understand what, all of the nuances are of these situations. And so what he was opening to was people talking to him, and he's listening to him, he's having these conversations. And it's changing his mind in the sense that people who don't look like Black people are identifying with the Black struggle in America. And there's something to say for that. And what he was doing, he was listening to that, and he was changing, with those stories. But what he was also saying is that I need to also make sure I understand what's going on. And these people, I'm listening to them, and they have to prove to me who they are. Because if their fights are only about what they want to do in their own country and not help, our cause, there are going to be tensions and issues. But if they're going to support us, and if we support them and we can be allies, we have to see how that goes. But he's cut down before all of that is really completed. He's in the process of doing that. That is that shift that he's doing at that time. He's internationalizing our issues. And I like to read a little bit from this appendix that we have in here. There was a questionnaire that the Islamic Center of Geneva had sent him, and they sent him like a few questions to ask him. And one of the questions they asked him is it true, even after you break away from Elijah Muhammad, you still hold the Black color as a main base and dogma for your drive under the banner of liberation in the United States? How could you, a man of your spirit, intellect, and worldwide outlook, fail to see in Islam its main characteristic from the earliest days as its message that confirms beyond doubt that ethnological oneness and quality of all races, thus striking at the very root of the monstrosity of discrimination? Endless are the texts of the Quran and prophetic sayings to this effect, and nothing would testify to that more than the historic fact that heterogeneous races, nations, and linguistic entities have always mingled peacefully in the homeland. And that was their question. And his answer was, as a Black American, I do feel that my first priority is to my 22 million fellow Black Americans who suffer the same indignities because of their color as I do. I don't believe my own personal problem is ever solved until the problem is solved for all 22 million of us. Much to my dismay, until now, the Muslim world has seemed to ignore the problem of Black Americans, and most Muslims who come here from the Muslim world have concentrated more effort in trying to convert white Americans than Black Americans. And I just want to say, like, when we talk about, yes, he was changing, but he still was fighting for the cause of Black Americans.
Yeah, that's right. Another question, what part of Malcolm's persona impressed your dad the most?
I mean, what dad learned so much from him as far as, the constant studying and reading everything. When he was reading that in the autobiography, how Malcolm read everything. I mean, Dad also read everything. I mean, as you know from your own conversations, how Dad, one of his biggest influences is H.L. Mencken.
That's right.
And an iconoclast. And what he liked about H.L. Mencken was he was an iconoclast. Mm-hmm. And he modeled a lot of his writing after Mencken. And Mencken is, yes, everybody says he's a racist, but he's also an iconoclast. And Dad took that from Mencken and learned that from Mencken and applied it to his craft. And, and that's what he was picking up from Malcolm. You read everything to improve yourself. You experience everything to improve yourself. And he really appreciated, most of all, his analysis. I mean, the reason why he would play Malcolm for us, every weekend, was because he wanted us to really hear this language about what we're experiencing. And this was during the 70s and 80s where it didn't resonate so as much when we were, I was at the time 10 years old and even younger, listening to it. It wasn't necessarily resonating because we're talking about we have integration, we have these opportunities. But as we got older and because we had already heard it and we knew it, we were working in the world, we saw it. And we were like, Malcolm was so right. And Dad really appreciated that. That's one of the things he really respected about him.
Now this, it might be too early to answer this question. What has been the reaction to the book by members of Malcolm's immediate family, like his daughters?
I don't know.
Perhaps they haven't had a chance to read it since it just came out.
Yeah.
Another question. Can we expect you to pen the biography of your dad? Les was so important to many Black journalists. He always encouraged us to be brave, but also to be good journalists, good writers, and researchers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm already just been going through, just going through his files now and his papers, and I definitely want to do some projects on that. So yeah, eventually I will be doing some projects. I'm not sure exactly, if it'll be a full-fledged biography, but I am definitely thinking about that.
Well, one interesting thing, I guess, about his biography, I guess, is when your dad first heard Malcolm in Hartford, Connecticut, and how that really changed his life.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's really interesting when we talk about like all these terms that we here in America as Black people have changed these different terms that we embrace, right? Colored, Negro, Black, African American, Afro American at one point, because at the end of Malcolm's life, Blacks were embracing Afro American, and but he was very instrumental in getting Black people in America to embrace Black, and that also, as I read to you, it didn't come from Elijah Muhammad. It came from his mother, who was teaching him from the Garveyite principles. And, Dad, when he went to see Malcolm speak in Hartford, he was interested. And it's funny, also, my Uncle John was there. I found out recently that my Uncle John was there, and he didn't know that my father was there. But it was an important moment for my father because Malcolm spoke about Negro. A lot of Blacks had embraced the term Negro, and Malcolm wanted to use Black, and he would switch between the terms in his speeches wherever he spoke. It wasn't just at this one; it was wherever he spoke, even in The Nation. Because I've listened to some of his lectures from The Nation where he's flipping between these terms. But in this particular lecture, he says, some of you out there don't like the term Black. You're uncomfortable with that. You want to be called Negro, but what does Negro mean? But Black in Spanish. So what you're telling me is I can call you Black in another language, but right. I can't call you Black in the language you speak. And that was just, a lightning strike for Dad, and then it made him really think about the relationships that Blacks have with white people from when he grew up in the South and in Hartford, where he said that most white people never felt threatened by Black people or saw them as equals. And Black people, while they would say that you can be anything, but realistically at that time, all he saw were they would be janitors, they were farmers, but they never were landowners, and forget being president of the United States. I mean, I'm really happy that both my parents, got to see Barack Obama's presidency. I mean, people can say what he did, and you can analyze that. He has a book coming out next month, but, and that can be analyzed till the end of time. But I think it's really important that my parents saw that, because that adds, another layer to what Black people are able to aspire to and to do, and how they're able to work within and out with and outside of the system.
Yeah, I know that we were determined to go to his first inauguration, no matter how cold it was. And I'm telling you, it was very cold, but it was worth it.
I like to mention one thing too,
sure.
that you and Dad, through the Trotter Group, met with Barack Obama.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I recall that meeting very well. Yeah, the Trotter Group was very important. As I mentioned before, it's an organization of Black columnists, and our conferences were very, very informative. And your dad was one of 3 founders, along with Dwayne Wickham and Derek Jackson. Here's a question.
Guys
Sorry, say it again.
I was working with you guys there too.
Absolutely, no question about it. And here's a question about you specifically. Given that your book publishing debut is a powerful finished product that brings closure to your father's legacy, what works do you dream about writing in the future as you build your own reputation? What current works and authors out now resonate with you?
I'm a huge fan of Roxane Gay as an essayist, but past people, I mean, my favorite writers is Zora Neale Hurston and Audre Lorde, as also an essayist. I mean, poet, everything that Audre Lorde did. But yeah, I mean, I think what's going on out there is so exciting. I haven't really, I mean, there are ideas that I'm working on and I haven't fully fleshed them out yet, and they will over time. But right now I'm really just focused on promoting this book. It's important because this is, you know, it's my father's life's work, and I just really wanted his voice out there. I mean, the way it was, the way like you and Dwayne and my mom and my uncles, you know, they remember his voice. It's really important to me that happened. And then, you know, as we go through this, then we'll see what happens with the future.
What do you think is the most important takeaway from this book?
It's important, I think, that people see Malcolm has a lineage. He has a family. There was a world he was born into. He's usually presented to us in a vacuum, and this fills in that picture. You know, we see him, you know, through the autobiography. He's fully formed, and he dies before the autobiography is even published. But what we really get to see here is, you know, how he was growing up, who he was with his siblings, what he was like as a child, but also and how that impacts us. Our family lives do impact us throughout our lives and everything that we do. And we never really had that story, and certainly not this richly, before this book. And I think that's really important.
Well, I think we have time for one more question from the audience. This one says, I saw a letter he wrote to his cousin that explained how he was at fault with spitting bad comments about Black women to Black men and how he needed to undo it. Can you explain, or is it explained in the book, how his relations with Black women changed as he determined he needed to reach that population on another level?
I mean, depending what phase are we talking about too, of what exactly we're talking about. I'm not familiar right now with that letter that he's talking about, but Malcolm definitely did evolve on women. You know, when he was growing up and in his hustling days, and he writes about that in his autobiography about particularly women prostitutes and how they were towards men, and women tend to castrate men, and he was derogatory towards women during his earlier years. But I would also say that he was younger, and he was a teenager actually during those days of his hustling days in Harlem. But in evolving, and you know, again, if you look at the appendix in the questionnaire, you know, I mean, we do talk a little bit about it, but it's also the people that he's surrounded by. When he builds up the temple in Harlem, in Hartford rather, he's very protective, you know, of the women, and how he talks about men and how they have to be protective of women. And you do see that. But in this questionnaire, you'll see in the appendix, it's important also to say that, you know, what he says, and I'll read a little bit. I'm not going to read the whole question, but his take on at the end of his life was that Muslim countries need to educate their women, and if they don't, they'll be backwards. A country that doesn't educate its women, a country is only as advanced as its women are. And so, at the end of his life, that's what he was thinking.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It looks like we're just about out of time, so I'll toss it back to Politics and Prose. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you both for such an incredible conversation. I think we all really learned a lot and got a lot out of this. Again, the book is called The Dead Are Arising, and you can purchase it through a link in the chat from Politics and Prose's website. And again, just want to thank you all for joining us. We want to thank you for your questions, and to thank Tamara and Joe for an excellent conversation. And,
Thank you.
yeah, and we will see you again next time on Politics and Prose Live.